Cool. We have 1 minute. Yep. Oh. Mm. 1 moment. Priya. Kia ora and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Today, UNICEF Aotearoa's young ambassadors are going to lead a kōrero all about climate experience and perspectives from New Zealand. Before we kick into our awesome conversation, I am going to pass to Priya to open up the space in the way that we know how with the opening karakia.
Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina kuta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Ihi aki ana te ata kura, he teo, he huhuka, he hohunga, te hei moriora.
Kia ora. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Today, we have the amazing opportunity to speak a little bit about our experience as New Zealanders about the climate. As you may know, Aotearoa New Zealand is sitting in a really interesting position when it's about the climate crisis. As you can see, it's a bit of a conundrum, understanding the ways in which we're going to be vulnerable to our own population and the ways in which other vulnerable populations are going to seek refuge in New Zealand. As one of the largest islands in the Pacific, we really want to take this responsibility seriously and have a really bold conversation about how we can support our communities in New Zealand and across the Pacific. As well as that, with UNICEF Aotearoa, we also have a mandate to understand the ways in which the climate crisis is also a children's rights crisis, and the ways in which children and young people are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and holding our incoming governments into account for our populations. So, holding those two things in weight, we are really excited to kick off with a conversation a little bit about youth climate action, specifically in Aotearoa and across the Pacific. So, we have three of our lovely ambassadors, as you can see in our beautiful photo as well. And we're just going to lead off the conversation. Before we get into all of the heavy details, just a brief introduction from you. Who are you? How you've ended up here? And something that comes to mind when you think about youth climate action.
Kia ora. My name is Thomas Blakie. I'm from Ōtautahi Christchurch in Te Waipounamu, the South Island of New Zealand. I think I'm sitting here today as a UNICEF young ambassador, really through the experiences that have shaped me as a child growing up in the earthquakes, having that really shaped me moving from my home and seeing my community really come together strongly and then slowly fade away with the decisions that were made. So it's really what shapes my interest in being a young ambassador and standing up for those communities and children who kind of come through these experiences. So, which I think is a real major part in what climate change is going to affect in Aotearoa New Zealand, with our disasters kind of increasing in intensity and changing the way that we live through um, flooding, through different rain events, wildfires now coming into it. So that's really experienced me, and then how those climate change events they affect young people. That's what's really brought me here. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Thomas.
E moa I whaatalofa tule mamalu wa tātou whaatasi nei tālofa lava. E malo lele, my name is Nele. I hail from the islands of Savaiu, Polo, and Tongatapu. I was born in Samoa, but I've had the privilege of being raised in South Auckland, 275 to the world. And for me being a Pacific person in the diaspora, um, the education system we have is colonial, as we all know. And for a lot of Pacific young people, that actually disconnects us from being able to engage in climate action spaces. And so for me, like, even though we learned about climate change in school, it never made sense in the way that it does within our Pacific worldviews. And so I learned about climate change from the stories my mother would tell me. My mother, who is 71, would tell me stories of how over the years she has seen our family home, half of it is now covered by water. And for Pacific Islanders and for Indigenous communities around the world, land is not just land, it's an ancestor. And with that, we tie our cultures with our language, we tie our language to it, we tie our rituals. And so when we think of things of our oceans drowning and islands drowning, places drowning, that also comes with the loss of our culture as well. So for me, I'm real motivated to be in the climate space, to advocate for making sure we platform young voices, but also Indigenous voices in the spaces as well. So I'm really honored to be here, connecting with everyone in the audience and everyone watching from home, and to share space with my beautiful friends here as well. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you, Nele.
Kia ora te whānau. My name's Priya and I whakapapa to Aotearoa, New Zealand. I currently live in Matamata, Waikato. For me, I am really here to advocate for children's rights. Obviously, we're here with UNICEF. I'm blessed to be a young ambassador this year. I've recently graduated from Matamata College, and there I really focused on upraising our youth, and I am a young mentor. And for me, I really want to ensure that our young generation's whole order is complete so that we can feel inspired to advocate for our climate action. That's why next year I'm going to do primary teaching so I can really connect with our youth fully.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Priya. And before I get into the meat of it, I also did not introduce myself. Kia ora, everyone. My name is Vira. I do a lot of work in the community space back in Aotearoa, but by passion, I'm a playwright, poet, and a storyteller. So feeling really privileged today, not only as a young ambassador, but to sit along my friends to have this really important conversation about the climate. So we're going to have this panel. We're going to chat about all of the things we love and are keen to see in the youth climate action space. Then we're going to swap out and you're going to meet three more of the ambassadors and chat about young New Zealanders' aspirations when it comes to the climate crisis and our hopes for Aotearoa New Zealand. So, Thomas, when you're thinking about youth climate action, what have you seen in Aotearoa that's inspired you?
Thank you for the question. I think growing up through schools and in the community, I think one example of this of climate action has been community tree planting. I think that's been a really amazing way for local communities and school children to kind of come together and to experience their environment and help feel like they're making a change in the environment. We've got a river just maybe 5 minutes walk from our home, and I've got when I was younger, we did tree planting there, kind of improving the waterways there. And now my younger brother, who's 10, he's doing the same thing with his school, with a like community land trust who are looking after the waterways. So I think that's a really amazing example of like community coming together in terms of climate change. It's all related to climate change as well. So they do like water quality testing. So it's a really big issue, and I think bringing these communities together with schools, that's a really amazing opportunity.
Yeah, of course. And I just want to touch on what you were, speaking of the generational impact and that legacy. How is that well, why is that so important in the communities that you are within and around?
Yeah, I think this intergenerational aspect of it is so important. Like the waterways, the waterway goes up from kind of near the airport and down. That's called the lower Styx, down to the estuaries at the bottom. And there was a, a paing at the bottom and a marae down the bottom, and the Mahinga examples all the way down. So like that restoration of the Mahinga and storytelling through all this is really intergenerational, and it's amazing that uh, I was doing the planting, and my grandparents come along. They do the planting now. My little brother's doing the planting. So it's all about storytelling and enjoying the landscape for what it is.
Oh, wonderful. And just to everyone, how do we see the ways in which climate change is impacting not only New Zealand as a whenua, as a land, but our younger communities, the communities that you surround yourselves within?
I think really the idea of climate change can really affect our youth's hope and aspirations. Um, Growing up, we really want to dream for big things, but it's really, really intimidating when we've got the big looming cloud of climate change, literally looming cloud. It's terrifying. And when we've got so many older people trying to get us to stand up and act, it's really hard to do so when we don't have the when we're not ensured to have a stable future.
Yeah, I think mine's very much similar to what Priya said. It's like the climate anxiety that's affecting a lot of our young people. It can become real, I guess, overwhelming. Obviously, as young people, you're already engaging in your own like coming of age story, trying to be main character. But then on top of that, you also have to worry about like whether we're actually going to have a future, whether we're actually going to have a place somewhere our families can grow. Whether like is it? I know a lot of young people and like the wānangas I've done this year, especially women, having conversations about like is it to bring a child into this world, and it's like because of the way it's going, like are they actually going to have something to inherit? And so it's a lot of that trying to think about the future but not seeing anything positive. So I think yeah, just real similar to what Priya was saying.
No, that's totally understandable. When we're talking about climate anxiety, do you think that there is the space to kind of use it as fuel? Well, how do we use climate anxiety? Because clearly it's not going away, to mobilize our young people so that way we can still have those actions.
I guess in terms of trying to turn climate anxiety into hope and fuel, I think that's something I'm definitely still working on. But a lot of the times when for me my fuel isn't really necessarily climate anxiety, or it wouldn't be, yeah, it wouldn't be those feelings. It would be more of having to think about why I would go into the space of obviously like when you're a young person, there's so many things that we're afraid of, but even adults have that. Everyone goes through it at some point. But it's about remembering why we stand in the spaces we are in, and I think a lot of the anxiety comes from young people just not being at the forefront or in decision making spaces. Like Thomas was saying, intergenerational spaces. But right now we're not seeing the intergenerationality because we're just not seeing young people at the table to be able to contribute about what it is our young people are actually afraid of. And so having that, it just kind of pushes you more to voice wherever you are. Obviously, with us being here at COP, and most of us, it's our first COP, trying to like share as much as we can and doing what we can. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but definitely I was like, we can do something, or something.
Absolutely, and obviously one of UNICEF Aotearoa's big asks is that we are asking the incoming government to establish a child and youth climate advisory council so that way young people are given that decision-making power at a national level to ensure that, we are heard and we can actually have an influence in the policy-making space. So definitely on the right track there. But what is there to say about some of the groups that you're within, about how they cultivate hope in the midst of anxiety? What are the tools that young people can, like us, can take in their daily lives to not be overcome by the anxieties?
I think especially for me growing up in such a small community, it's really apparent that I've seen a lot of disparity within our youth. Um, as a minority, as tangata whenua, I've seen a lot of discrimination against our people, but I've also seen my the young children that I've mentored at my school. I've seen them overcome that. I've seen them stand up and be proud as who they are, just not being afraid of all the discrimination that we've had in our community, and they just use that, like we said before, we're using that anxiety to fuel us, and I think a lot of that came from our tipuna, thinking about our ancestors, taking that strength, the knowledge that they've already overcome challenges that we're facing today.
Yeah, and I think building off that, one of the main things a lot of our young people, especially like I've seen in the Pacific spaces, is cultural connection. As like Pacific peoples, climate action doesn't come with your hands. It comes with your connection to your environment, to your family. Like my service to climate action is based on my love for my family. It's based on my love for my ainga and for me wanting to make sure that my family back in Samoa, my parents who are living there, aren't experiencing like adverse impacts of climate change. And so I think my favorite climate actions that I see in Aotearoa is like Māori and Pacific young peoples who are going around, obviously being like Pacific peoples in the diaspora, it's really hard to practice your culture. because a lot of our things are tied to where we are and tied to being on our land. But like just doing what they can to re-indigenize themselves, like reading up on like what some of our like cultural custodians have taught, having like talanoa, having like spaces in which they share, to be able to take that around and using that to inform what climate activism looks like. Because in this space called climate action, in our homelands, it's called a way of life. Like there's nothing different, there's nothing special about doing something that's considered climate action because that's just what you do, looking after whenua, looking after the whenua, looking after your islands. It's just part of your cultural identity and not something, not like just some like over or harsh responsibility that we're trying to like fight. It's always been a part of us. So I think cultural connection is one of the best things that a lot of our young peoples can do as climate action.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think building off the cultural connection, that climate change, there are all these negative effects, but then how we respond to it, I think is really important that we connect culturally because it is an opportunity to like decolonize some existing ways of using the land, ways of being, some of the spaces that uh, will come, which will be affected and we'll have to adapt going forward. Some of these spaces uh, aren't how they used to be used, and there's problems with how they're being used now, and then that's going to be affected through climate change. But around the waterways, if we're building homes that can't be there in the future, I think that's a great opportunity to decolonize the spaces and go back to um, existing, pre-existing things like mahi kai, access to waterways that should be there already but haven't been able to. So I think adapting is a really important when we respond culturally. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely a place where New Zealand gets to stand out. We have the gift of Te Ao Māori, Māori knowledge, and ways of being where we can lean on things like kaitiakitanga, looking at guardianship, the ways that we look after the land and the way the land looks after us, and, reintroducing that relationship that it's about mutuality, this symbiotic relationship rather than something that's extractive or exploitative. So something Aotearoa is really grateful for and something that we get to return to when we get to be in these large climate conversations. Luckily, during our time as ambassadors, we've had the opportunity to go into different communities and do all sorts of engagements. And it would be great to know, what have you seen during those engagement periods from young people, not just in our big cities like Auckland and Wellington, but in our more regional areas? What are they saying? How are they feeling? How can you, if you can, capture some of the feelings that you've been in touch with over the past couple months?
So obviously coming from a rural community, it's very isolating. So in the big cities, we've got a lot of rallies, a lot of protests, a lot of strike actions, but we're just by ourselves in our small little towns, and it's hard to feel like we can really make a difference by ourselves. So that's something that I really noticed doing a lot of engagements in my own school. And yeah, it's just terrifying for a lot of us, but then that can also lead to a strong feeling that we need to ignore what's happening. A lot of the people in my classes just wanted to ignore it, not listen to it, so that they wouldn't have to stress about it. It just led to avoidance.
Yeah, I guess like for a lot of young people that I got to speak to, especially in the Pacific community, there was such a disconnect the idea of youth climate action, mostly because of the way we kind of view it and the way we kind of what actions we associate with it. So thinking of things like doing strikes or doing things like posting on social media and stuff like that, that's very much what we have that's the idea in a lot of people's head of youth climate action. But as a brown kid in like Aotearoa, like we have low statistics of education. And so if I were to go on a strike, like no one would care. Like I'm just adding to like statistics of brown kids being truant at school. And with our incoming government that want to find parents who are saying like where kids are being truant to school, regardless of whether it's because they're working for their family or like working in climate action, it creates this massive barrier because a lot of the things that we associate with youth climate action is things that Pākehā kids can do, not things that brown kids can actually be part of. And that's why it's real for me. Like, I know a lot of the young people I was talking to, it's really important we start centering and platforming Indigenous, Māori and Pacific ways of climate actions, because those ways it can bring more of our peoples into that space rather than creating this idea where we're making heroes of certain groups of young people. Then when other groups of young people are taking part of it, it's just adding to like the discrimination we face as populations. As well as I think for a lot of young people though, even when those things are there in that way, it never stops our young people. So one of my favorite regions I got to talk to was Whakatane, which is, where is it? It's like Bay of Plenty. I'm sorry, this place called Bay of Islands or Bay of Plenty, and I always have to be like, which one is which? For our young peoples in like the Bay of Plenty of Whakatane, they really lack local government spaces for their young people. And so for a lot of them, like their young communities just set up the groups anyway. And even if they don't have funding, they pay for it themselves. Like we have young people who are working like full-time jobs who are doing university, and that money is going towards their family, but then also being able to fund initiatives for their own young people. Um, or things like putting young people in schools, being able to get some like training and skills, but then also doing climate actions. And I think the thing I loved about that space was because Whakatane, they were talking about how it's becoming more of like a elderly retirement village. It's where people are going um, after, I guess, yeah, retirement. Um, I don't know if you go retirement, but at that kind of moving there. But what it's done is that for a lot of young people, they don't have that space. They don't have that voice. And so they were like, we can't have strikes because like it would be like maybe like a few young people like, and where would they like march to as like a center. So it was just like a whole bunch of things of, again, a whole thing of when we associate certain actions with youth climate action, it just removes a whole certain group. So for them, they were like having stuff of like online wānanga, like spaces where they can learn together, but then also being able to connect to like their iwi and doing work in that space. I think it's just, yeah, my biggest takeaway was like young people, if there is no way, we'll find a way or make it ourselves.
Yes, so I travelled down to Dunedin, talked to people in Dunedin and Christchurch as well. I think the main takeaways that I've received, well, through our workshops and then also in other spaces, is just climate change. The topic of climate change is really uh, all-consuming in a lot of ways and ever present in everything that we do. We're always thinking about it with like transport now, what we eat, um, and how kind of a city works. That's from my perspective as a someone interested in urbanism as well. But just it's really all consuming in everything you do day to day life and all the ways that the government plans and local government plans um, fix climate change going forward. I think a lot of the people that I talk to are kind of uh, disheartened a little bit in just the way that things are still going forward and in ways that aren't good for the future. And we need to be like making big changes now. And we talked about food waste that came up down south. Um, those changes there and planning for the city, how buildings work, how people still need to depend on cars. We can experience that in Dubai a little bit as well. Um, but yeah, just how climate change is all consuming. It's all around us. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see from what you've all described, there's almost this process of young people being unaware of the issues, slowly getting aware, but then being in denial, not wanting to stress themselves out or be overwhelmed by the issues, realizing that they can't, that this is their future, and we have to face it forward. And then looking at all the other obstacles that can be in our way, whether you're from a rural community and you don't have an engaged and active citizenry like you would like, or being in an aging population and you just have a limited amount of young people, and doing climate actions might go against cultural values or the ways of being that you believe to be good and successful for yourself, and coming into ways of, well, already the way in which the world exists is already so anti positive climate or climate resilient that you might as well stay the same way, and all of these different ways that eventually lead to young people sitting where you are right now, because you go through all those processes, and you've all probably experienced those feelings of being disheartened and frustrated. What can I do where I am? And now you're all in Dubai looking at pop. So, when you think about your own experience, seeing what you've seen in communities, what do you think we can do to enable more young people from a wider range of backgrounds to be where you are right now? And whether that is in speaking from your own community or speaking how to be good allies to other communities.
Uh, for me, I think it's bringing these spaces to people and not expecting them to go to spaces where like the government is, local government, talking about these issues. Because young people in different communities, they're experiencing climate change as we are now, and they've got the solutions as well. Um, and then going into consultations, going to like airy spaces with adults as well. These aren't spaces that are welcoming for ideas and solutions that are within us. So I think bringing the change makers, decision makers to see young people, experience young people, get in a room, get a piece of paper, jot down some ideas, look at some maps, see how things are changing. I think it's really coming down to the level of young people in different communities who aren't engaged and can't engage because the system isn't created for them.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Thomas. And like something to add on to that is also reevaluate who you have in the room. Like I see you COP28 with your 2.5K like fossil lobbyists here. Like the heck, like at a place where we're here to talk about climate action, we have so much more influence of like fossil fuels at a time where a lot of like young people are calling for a fossil fuel phase out. Like it makes no sense. And then to like what Thomas was saying, it's not a space that welcomes. How do you then expect to bring like group of young people into a space where there's so much more like power and importance given to another group? It's about evaluating actually who are we prioritizing right now where we are. And I think in Aotearoa it's become probably like scarier reality with obviously like our climate minister not being in cabinet, as well as looking at the removal of the ban of oil and gas exploration out in Aotearoa, which gave us a fossil fuel award at 2028. Not a horrible that's New Zealand. I'm from Aotearoa. But thinking about those kind of things, it's like you have to really evaluate like actually where are you now before you bring young people. I believe that everyone wants a young leader, but no one knows how to look after a young leader. No one wants the responsibility of looking after a young leader. But it's so important because when you start looking at safety of bringing young people into space, we actually look at the safety for our whole community. So I think yeah, adding like bringing young people into the space, but if you're going to talk about limited resources, yeah, kick someone else out. And we all know who.
Yeah, so in my small little bubble of New Zealand, we don't really have any youth-led or youth-centered activities. I think the main issue when talking about youth activism in the climate space for us rural kids is that they don't prioritize us. In our council, we've got a whole lot of older people who don't care about us. For them, they just need to tick a box saying, yes, we talk to the youth. That's why they only come to the leaders, so like the head students of a school, which includes myself. They just talk to us. They don't talk to the rest of our school. They don't take into account that people might have varying opinions, which may be revolutionary. Who knows? One of us might hold the cure to cancer. We don't know. And they're not going to know until they start focusing on our opinions and start leading activities and engagements that surround us, not just something that they feel they need to do because they're missing us out.
Yeah. Oh, all right. In a dream world, all the resources at your fingertips. Give us the peak Aotearoa New Zealand youth delegation to COP. Who's a part of the delegation? What are we doing? What do we have at our disposal?
Chloe Swarbrick.
Oh,
Nele.
um, amazing. You have all the resources at your fingertips to fund the most youth-friendly delegation to COP. Who's a part of it? Who's leading? What are we doing? What do we have at our disposal?
while you guys are thinking, I'm going to just so kia ora. My name is Amanda Ellis, and I am on the board of UNICEF Aotearoa, and absolutely thrilled to have this fabulous delegation here, and wanted to thank especially our Global Director of Advocacy, Teresa Tapania Ashton, who's here, who's going to wave. Thank you so much for bringing this here. And very especially to thank our former Minister for Climate Change, James Shaw, who is the man who made this all possible. So I am going to put him right on the spot while you're still thinking and invite him up to say a few words, because it was when Teresa, Michelle Sharp, who's the CEO of UNICEF Aotearoa, and the board were all talking and saying, we really need to have youth voices at COP, and we really need to have a delegation of youth from Aotearoa New Zealand for the first time. And James very generously allowed me to come and call on him and put this idea forth. And then Teresa and Michelle followed up. And James is really the one who made this happen. He moved all obstacles, which we are super grateful for. But not only that, he also helped support our suggestion to the CEO of the Ministry of Education that climate education be included throughout the curriculum. And what we have included is something called Turn It Around for Climate Action, Youth Visions and Voices. And this is a global project run out of ASU, Wrigley Global Futures Lab, Teachers College. And our Teachers College has made this a totally inclusive project, 193 countries, youth voices from everywhere. And this is now being used in schools throughout New Zealand as a free resource. So youth visions and youth voices telling policymakers what we need to be doing, telling them what we can learn from nature that we can't learn from school. So, James, you have been an incredible support. Thank you. Please come and say a few words.
Well, kia ora koutou. Thanks, Amanda. I also just wanted to, if you're doing acknowledgements, thank the officials, in particular those from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, because they changed a long-standing practice about the way that we do party badges. And so the kind of your party overflow badges, that's actually due to a change in MFAT policy as well. And I've been sitting at the back watching, right? And it's awesome. I'll tell Chloe that you said that, but she actually did get a party overflow badge, but she couldn't afford to come. So your question, what could we do with all of the resources and so on and so forth? Actually, if there were unlimited resources, she would actually be here. And I know she'd be your biggest champion as well. So I'm just kind of Chloe's warm-up act, really. So, so I just wanted to say how grateful I am that you're all here, and to UNICEF for pulling it together, because historically we've had sort of one or two young people on the government delegation, and we've kind of handpicked those, and then you tend to see the same people and so on and so forth. So the fact that we've got such a broad-based group of people selected all over the country by through UNICEF, obviously a UN agency in partnership with the UNFCCC, I think is fantastic. And I'm stunned that you're here, and it's really exciting to see. So thanks very much for it, and I look forward to your answers now that you've had oodles of time to think about it.
Kia ora. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I don't know. I think for me, obviously, there's so many like political leaders and people that are coming in my mind, like Hanara Fiti Maipi Clark, who is the youngest MP we've had in Aotearoa at 21, her first time voting, now being in government or in parliament. But I think for me, like as I was thinking of names and stuff, I have to really shout out to our young leaders out in the space as well, like Tale Bryan, Brianna Fruin, our Pacific Climate Warriors in Aotearoa, and all our Indigenous and Māori different groups, because in my head, I'm like, a lot of the celebrities and politicians that I could name are already in these spaces. They're already delegates in so many other spaces. And it's actually time we start looking at our various leaders who don't necessarily have the CV, but it's because they haven't had the chance to speak. So for me, it would be about having more of our community leaders, not the ones that are necessarily like platformed everywhere, but our young leaders who are in their communities and just showing love where they can.
Yeah. Would you both like the opportunity to talk as well? Like, if we were designing the dream delegation, if there's anyone else that you would like to see, or something that you would like for us to accomplish?
Um, I think besides Thomas Paul, um, I'd so, I think I'd go for some random kids from a random school, like myself 3 years ago, or like my best friends. I think it would be such a good opportunity to give them the mic, to give someone who's not necessarily a leader, to just give them a voice. It's really important that we acknowledge people who aren't already acknowledged, because obviously we've already had influential roles in our community. It's important to pay attention to those who don't.
Yeah, I think we're very lucky to be here today. This time, very thankful to UNICEF Aotearoa, for making this a thing that they can do every year, so they can have youth voices at the table. I think that's really important. So we know that young people are represented every time at COP, because it's so important, and like we need to be at the table. Young people need to be at the table. So yeah, if there's some sort of system to make it happen every time, that would be amazing.
Awesome. So just bouncing off what you said, because we are here, this is only our first day at COP. What is the action that is top of mind for you to complete while we're here?
I think for me, especially because I'm so young, I'm focused on collecting all this mātauranga that I wouldn't be able to collect in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, supporting a lot of the young work that our communities are doing to phase out fossil fuels. So this morning, the Pacific Power Up calling for, of course, the phasing out of fossil fuels. They put up a banner. So if anyone's near the media center, there's a big, like, long mosaic piece of art, and each piece was like painted in different like islands and different Pacific communities around the world. So make sure to go check that out. So kind of supporting that work. But also 685 to the world. I'm here to make sure everyone sees my Samoan flag at some point. Forgot it today, but I'll bring it tomorrow. And if you see me walking around with it, feel free to take a photo.
Action top of mind while you're here, what you would like to accomplish.
I think it would be really amazing to see the negotiations taking place, me being inside the room. We've heard about it, but yeah, it'd be amazing, really interesting to see how it all works behind the scenes.
Oh, amazing. So it's great. We have some knowledge building, connections, expanding our mind, connecting with other young people, learning their tactics, taking it home, and putting our government to work, of course. So, just to finish off the end of this conversation and moving into our next conversation, just if you could share some words to the young people back home, anything that you want to share about being here, about holding some of their identities, what are you saying to them?
I think for me, for our Pacific young peoples, our young peoples in Southside 275, as well as like Indigenous young people around the world, a lot of the time we talk about how our ancestors inform our work. But I also want all our young people to know that you are living ancestors. Like, ancestors aren't like people who have passed on. Like, the ocean is an ancestor, but it's very much living. The sun is an ancestor. It's very much living. So remembering that all the work that we do in our spaces is showing that we are great ancestors, and we're doing a lot for our communities already, whether it's a conversation with your parents, or whether it's like standing at a strike or coming to COP, or even just doing like initiatives in your school. Everything contributes towards it, and don't let anyone tell you it doesn't.
Mm.
I think for me, it would be that we truly do belong here in these spaces. We belong here. Like, coming from a Māori person, um, even the children who don't, our rangatahi and tamariki, who don't have parents, people who have just been passed along the line to whoever will care to take care of them. We belong in these spaces. If it doesn't feel like anyone cares about you, we belong here, and it's our future. We're young, and it's our choice to make a difference.
Um, yeah, I think just to say that everything you're doing, whether it's big or small, makes a difference. Everything adds up. each individual person has different strengths. So in Aotearoa, it's one big community. Everyone works together to build a better future, and it is getting better bit by bit, small piece by small piece. But yeah, I think just stay strong. We're getting through it. Yeah. Kia kaha.
That's a beautiful way to end this panel. If you all join me giving a big round of applause to Priya, Nele, and Thomas. Not yet. Awesome. So we're just going to take a 5-minute breather, swap out our panelists, but feel free to come up to anyone up and just have a bit of a quick corridor before we jump into the next conversation. Can you ask before or after karakia? Kia ora, and welcome back to part 2 of our UNICEF Aotearoa Ambassador Korero. So we are back with fresh ambassadors who are in the stands waiting for their time to shine, and we get the opportunity to chat more, less about the action and more about our aspirations, how we would reimagine Aotearoa and our hopes for our climate future. So I'm just going to pass it off to Ngārita to start off our introductions.
Thanks, Vira. Kia ora, I'm Ngārita. I whakapapa to Ngāi Tamanahiri up in Muriwaiwai, but I'm born and bred in Christchurch, so I lived in the south of Christchurch. My whole family's from the east side of Christchurch, so that's very high Māori Pasifika population, and that really comes through in my advocacy with inequalities that come out from the Christchurch earthquake, really trying to advocate for low socioeconomic areas of Christchurch and make sure that everyone's benefited from the repair of Christchurch.
Thank you, Ngārita. Kia ora, my name is Kaylee. I am from Niue, which is a little Pacific island, which I'm very proud of. I am 21 years old. I live in the Waikato, so that's very interesting. I am in university studying history and English. I'm graduating, so yay. Very passionate about bringing children into the spaces and making sure their voices are heard. So yeah.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, koutou. Ko te matatamonga ko Toki Toki Te Awa no Heretanga Aho ko Finley toka ingoa. Hello, my name is Finley Duncan and I come to UNICEF from Hawke's Bay. I come to UNICEF as a young ambassador off the back of Cyclone Gabrielle, which came through and shook a lot of the North Island of New Zealand, and coming from Hawke's Bay absolutely devastated a lot of our primary industries there. And as someone who's really passionate about water and making sure that we do what we can to preserve our natural waterways and our oceans, having those natural resources absolutely devastated was such a massive, big blow to our communities. So I'm here to advocate for sustainable water use and making sure that we listen to our rural communities and listen to them when it comes to climate change, because they're the people who are going to be impacted most.
Oh, thank you so much, Finley. Behind us, we have a quote from you. Young people want to be heard. We speak up only to be pushed down. And I think that's a brilliant way to encapsulate the status quo for young people right now. What are you all seeing across your communities? Of course, we want to aspire, but what are you seeing right now in terms of the attitudes and the behaviors around the climate action conversation?
I think a lot of it is distraught in a lot of cases, seeing the absolutely devastating effects that climate change is having around the world and in New Zealand is really debilitating for a lot of people. And it really is not a fun thing to see when you look around your community. But I think what we're seeing from young people is a desire to fight, really, is that young people are willing to stand up and talk about these issues, and they want to sit at the table and they want to be challenging our politicians and our decision makers to actually make decisions that will impact them in the future.
Thank you.
I'm not really seeing a lot of climate action in my community. I also live in like a rural town, so there's like a lot of poverty going on. So everyone has other issues to worry about, which is granted, like living, cost of living, housing. So climate and climate action is not really something that they're talking about because they don't really have the capacity to. So I think it's more fixing those problems and then allowing the youth to talk more about climate change and how to fix them, because with climate cycle, oh my gosh, cycle real, like a lot of our land was flooded and that like ruined our farming and all that stuff. So it was very impactful, but like the youth didn't pick up on it, which was really weird. But yeah.
Something that I found positive is the revitalisation of te ao Māori and te reo Māori. As Māori people, we've always known our climate the best. With colonisation, the Pākehā perspective on how to manage climate has really swayed how New Zealand has managed the climate outcomes at the moment. So this revitalisation of te ao Māori, te reo Māori is really positive to see young people take climate change into their own hands, especially young Māori people. As tangata whenua, it's important to know that you have the capabilities to control climate change or at least mitigate and manage it. So as Māori people, seeing protests just the other week, to government policies and knowing that there is that drive to keep Te Ao Māori in the climate space is just really inspiring.
Oh, and definitely something that I just want to jump on, talking about the revitalization of Te Ao Māori as way to mobilize young people to get out of this despair and the attitudes of not feeling like there is enough to do. What else can you see in the communities that you surround yourselves within as really strong tools and positive motivators to allow young people to shift from feeling like they can't do anything, feeling really frustrated, and feeling activated and engaged?
Well, going back to Te Ao Māori, something that really inspired me was Matatini. That's a kapahaka festival and it celebrates Māori. And Wanaraupu from, I believe it was around Finley's way from the Hawke's Bay, they had their legs covered in mud to symbolise Cyclone Gabriel and the effects it had on their iwi and on their hapu. So just performative activism is a really strong pathway for Māori to take, especially when they're not represented in government spaces, using performances such as kapahaka to show your outrage for the climate outcomes is just really inspiring.
Absolutely.
I've been seeing a lot of like same as Thomas tree planting, especially bringing back more of the native land plants, which has been really cool. I've been really involved with that, and it's been really good to like bring the community together and share knowledge and ways to look after the land.
No, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things that have been really inspiring in the climate space is taking climate change as a means of talking about what we value as a community and how climate change is going to ravage that in the future. And I'm in the water space. Beach cleanups have been exactly the same sort of thing on a different sphere, where beach cleanups haven't just been about going up and picking up plastic, but it's actually been about what families can do together. I had a friend who said it was their birthday and they were asking their parents asked them what they wanted to do for their birthday or what they wanted. And they said, I don't want you to get me anything. I want you to come with me on a beach cleanup so that we can do it as a family together and we can do something that actually really supports what I value in this community. So taking the understanding of what we think about our environment as being a means of talking about actually what strikes us as a person, I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is something so valuable in seeing the ways in which other young people in your communities take tangible steps, or people who take really bold actions to demonstrate the ways in which the climate influences them, their communities, and their ways of life. So, so impactful. Just thinking on that, what can you see in the time that you've spent being a UNICEF Young Ambassador, in the engagements that we've been able to undertake, that has been particularly highlights of the way that young people are talking about the future?
That's a great question. So I go to Christchurch Girls High School, which is an urban high school, but we've got borders, so they're from rural communities. And being rural girls in a space, in an urban space, they realize they see climate change from an urban perspective rather than a rural one. So something that they've seen, most of them come from like South Canterbury, very dry places, yet they host dairy farms and like farms that take quite a harsh toll on the climate, run huge irrigation and are just for profit rather than for climate. So circling back to that through my consultations, they've realised that the future in farming is adapting their farms to what their land can hold, not using it for profit. So the future is really managing the climate, managing their environment rather than focusing on the economic benefits that they can get from the land.
Oh, I think one of the big things that I'm thinking about in terms of climate change that I'm hearing from my community is an acceptance at high level that climate change has to be front of mind in all decisions that are made. That it's not just in the environmental sectors where climate change has to be thought about, but actually when we're looking at, how do we build our housing? What do we do in terms of the art that we support? Climate change has to be something that has to be thought about in these areas because otherwise it falls to the background again, or it's a message that's left out. And so making sure that climate change is a value and something that is placed at the forefront in all sort of industries and areas has been a really key theme that I've seen coming out.
Um, the thing was, it was creating space for climate change. So a lot of the youth in their communities was creating like climate change groups, which was really interesting and really cool to see that fact that a lot of the governmental things in place are really prohibiting them to actually get together and talk about climate change. So the fact that they're able to break down these barriers and still be able to talk to people and do climate initiatives, which is really cool and very inspiring.
And something else that you said a little bit earlier that I really wanted to capture is the contention that a lot of young people find themselves in between, whether it is in their daily lives and their social commitments. So, wanting to undertake climate activations, but are facing difficulties like poverty, lack of education, maybe unstable households, and having to weigh up those responsibilities. What do you think that we can do as people who want to mobilize young people can offer so that way people can balance those contentions better?
I feel like more governmental help would be really helpful, like really addressing poverty, especially in rural areas. There's a lot more than I think people realize. So being able to take pressures off the youth allows them to talk more, which is really good, and it creates like a more of a community feeling, which allows them to address other issues like discrimination and stuff. So I feel like being having poverty addressed is really a big step that we need to take as a country.
No, of course. And having that high level investment and commitment so that way young people feel like they actually have the capacity to contribute in the ways they want to. Yeah. Speaking more about, the reimagining, enabling other young people to think about how we want, well, a climate resilient Aotearoa New Zealand. For each of you, what does that look like in your mind?
Um, Something I found really interesting when researching climate change is a Ngāi Tahu policy, and it was what's good for Ngāi Tahu is good for Aotearoa. And I believe that's very impactful in the fact that a future where iwi and Māori tangata whenua and also Pasifika cultures who are so interlinked with Māori cultures are really taken into account for the future of climate change really benefits us. So not looking at it from a economic perspective, but looking at it as what's good for the environment, what's good for tangata whenua, and what's good for our children. And as UNICEF, I think children are the forefront of the policy, especially Māori children who are so disproportionately affected by climate change and by colonialism. So in a way, for climate change is really addressing Ngāi Tahu iwi who know our Māori tangata whenua, Māori o rangatahi the best.
Yeah, I mean, number one friend of mine is that the discussions around climate change have to be around adaptation and not just mitigation. We've come too far. Really, that mitigation can't be just the topic of conversation that we've got because in the future, there might not be one. So looking at things like managed retreat and things like that, that's not something that we can go, oh, well, managed retreat isn't real. We're not going to have to deal with it. We are going to have to deal with it. It's a very real thing. And so finding ways to actually engage in moving our communities to safer areas rather than just sort of, oh, we can put up a seawall or something like that, because that isn't going to solve the problem in the long term. In the long term, it's just going to keep getting worse and all walls are overcome eventually or torn down. So we have to find other ways of moving around that. And that looks like mobilizing as a country together to solve these issues. One of the solutions that has been talked around managed retreat is around expanding local council areas to provide housing for more people who they need it. But the problem is that in New Zealand, we have so little space that there is no room to expand local councils. We can't just buy more housing and then move people to safer areas because that's bordering a different council, and those people are already filled to the brim with people and houses, and they have no more space to offer them.
I just really feel like it brings back to giving youth more, like giving them more of a chance to have a voice. My local council doesn't have a youth board. Neither does the one in Hamilton, I believe, in the Waikato. So it's like they're really just shutting the youth down and more catering to the retirement. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we have iwi involvement. We're talking about climate adaptation and resilience, greater level of youth engagement in governance spaces on a national and regional and local level. When we're thinking about engaging with young people on those governance levels, what does that look like? What's the dream of it to look like?
Well, the number one biggest thing that I'm not seeing in the community at the moment is closing the loop
Mm.
around information and young people's involvement. Is that a lot of people reach out to young people in often a very tokenistic way, and then actually don't incorporate that advice, and then don't tell young people that they've incorporated that advice into their plans or into their submissions, or and then those young people don't know what's happened to that advice at all. They've just spoken into the void and nothing's talked back at them.
Mhm.
And so these young people need to know that actually people in key decision making positions are listening to them, because if they're not, then that's a problem. Or if they are, but they're not talking back, then young people don't have any motivation to keep going, because to them it's just absolutely worthless. There's no purpose into it
Mhm.
and doing it. And so it's important to come to hopefully have young people listen to a forum like COP,
Yeah.
because that means that young people can be listened to around the world when they want to speak out. And then we can take that back home into New Zealand and say, hey, look, we can do it on an international level. Surely a local council can do it. Surely our government can do it.
For sure.
Hopefully.
Closing the loop, building accountability frameworks. Kaylee, Ngārita, anything to add?
I feel like Finley really just sums it up.
What I was going to say is engaging with youth from low socioeconomic areas who are most affected by climate change. With cousins who live on the east side of Christchurch who are already experiencing that because of the effects of the Christchurch earthquake, experiencing flooding, experiencing lack of water. But these children on the east side of Christchurch, they don't have the opportunity to go engage with us like UNICEF, because they've got to worry, is there food on the table tonight? Do I have clothes for the future? They've got to worry about the here and now. So really, if you want to make change with those people in these areas, you have to go to them, not expect them to come to you. So it's really making that effort to go see those lower socioeconomic communities and hear the first-hand stories of how climate change is affecting them.
Yeah, absolutely. So making sure the most vulnerable aren't, you're not just waiting for them to arrive at your doorstep, really taking the time to commit and invest to seeing them where they are, seeing the communities in which they are in. Oh, absolutely fantastic. And there's also something to be said about appropriately compensating young people for their knowledge and their time and their effort. It's coming with a lot of lived experience and a lot of taonga. There's a lot of trauma in climate spaces. I can definitely reflect on Cyclone Gabrielle, the Auckland anniversary floodings, and how difficult it was for young people to not have homes to live in, to also be in emergency housing, communities in which there are high refugee and migrant populations, not knowing how to even navigate emergency warnings because they were in languages that they understood. And when they were coming out translated, the information has changed. So making sure that we are able to capture and protect our most vulnerable in all shapes and forms. So thinking about the ways in which we can see different governments, agencies, community organizations, and groups, how we want them to do better for our young people, communicating more, communicating across the board, a broad array of young people. What would you like to see as the ideal way forward? If you were to give, your top 5 tips on how we're engaging with young people, how we want them to lead climate action, how we're going to enable them to do so, what would you like to see?
I would like to see opportunities given to people who don't necessarily, as Nele touched on, don't have the CV or maybe don't have the opportunities given to them, because oftentimes they have the most first-hand experience with climate change, but they don't have the opportunity to engage with their school, with their community, because they've got other priorities to worry about. So if you were to look forward in climate change policy, it's really providing opportunity for all, but especially those underdogs who have so much to give. That often comes in the form of immigrants, Pasifika, Māori, and LGBTQIA communities who don't feel represented in the space but should be.
And just to talk further to that, is breaking down the colonial structures that have disenfranchised these groups from so long as well. Is when you want to engage with young people, you have to do it on their terms. You've got to go out to them, and often that means taking away the colonial confines that actually prevent those young people from talking to them at the very start, and actually reaching out to our Māori and to our Indigenous and Pasifika communities. Yes, these communities, and making sure that these groups are listened to, but not in a very regimented, a very governmental way, as Thomas talked about earlier. Not inviting those young people into your space and forcing them to go through the same regimented process as often highly advanced lawyers or accountants are doing who are being paid to go, but actually reaching out to those young people, to all young people, no matter who they are, and making sure that we listen to those people.
To follow on from Finley, I feel like also not going into the room with questions you've already answered is a big thing. So having open-ended questions that you truly want to know the answer to is a really big thing and something that a lot of government agencies need to put in place.
No, thank you. And I guess we all have to address the elephant in the room. If you're not from New Zealand, we have a new incoming government, and it's an interesting makeup of people. And already, what we're seeing off the top is a call to go back to offshore oil and gas exploration. We're seeing a minister for climate who sits outside of cabinet. We're seeing a lack of youth focus, a lack of respect towards Titiriti o Wai, tangata whenua, tangata moana. We have a lot of our vulnerable communities out on the chopping block, basically, because we are now sitting with a government that is not representative of our population at all. What is the call to action? What's the message that you want to say coming from a young person, holding this experience, holding all of these holding all this knowledge about how the climate's affecting the communities that you get to exist within and around?
Vera, we saw the response from Māori last week, or it might be this week. My time's gone with work travelling, but Māori took to the streets. You can't erase us from the government. You can't take our names away from it. The language is still always going to be spoken. My koro wasn't allowed to speak Māori at school, but my cousins and I are here saying karakia, taking te ao Māori to the world. So you can't erase Indigenous cultures, and you won't in climate change spaces either.
I'd just first like to say Chloe Swarbrick for Prime Minister. But yeah, to talking off Ngārita, I feel like European people can't erase the Indigenous people the land that they're already on. Like that's just messed up. And yeah, I feel very heated about the new government.
Yeah, I mean, coming to it from an apolitical standpoint from UNICEF, I don't want to talk about the government so much, but you can definitely talk about their policies.
Yep.
And the policies that we're seeing are contrary to all the science, are contrary to the commitments that are being made in this forum this week and over the last week as well, and are contrary to what we're hearing from the people around New Zealand. And in those two aspects, they are wrong and they oppose UNICEF's values.
And I feel like they are not going and talking to other minorities. They're just like looking around the room of other male, stale, and pale men. So maybe like opening the room about a bit more would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And, because we are in this interesting position, we have a heady 100 days ahead of us. What are the things that you are taking as actions in your daily lives to kind of stand in your values, stand in the issues that you hold close to you, specifically in the climate crisis in Aotearoa?
The transport agency is still waka kotahi. I'm still going to continue to call agencies as I feel to call them, but it's also continuing as an individual, continuing practices that mitigate or just try and manage climate change. So just use public transport, stuff like that, and really trying to not take the governmental policies too hard as much as it may seem like it's the end of the world, but it's not. I suppose you're still an individual at the end of the day, and you can still make those little changes to really mitigate climate change.
For me, it's more leaning into the te reo Māori and learning it, so I can use that as a way of resilience, even though it is not my Indigenous language. Learning it and then sharing it with other people has been really helpful. And yeah,
I mean, the biggest thing is that climate change doesn't stop just because of we have a change in government. So the work is exactly the same, really, is that our waterways still keep flowing, our trees still keep growing, and the earth temperature still keeps rising. So fighting against climate change is something that happens regardless of who's on top, who's in power, is that actually we need all the grassroots level movement and the governance level movement from businesses and from the private sector and from our people, regardless of which government we have in power at the day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's definitely a sustainable way of thinking. Is there any other modes of thought that keep you going, that keep you feeling empowered against the frustration that we can face when we're looking at current events, when we're seeing what's going on around us? What keeps you strong?
It's that kind of Māori perspective that you're just like looking after the land. You're not owning it. You don't own the land, so you're looking after it for future generations.
Mm.
So my activism comes from a desire to have a healthy planet for those who come after me, not a healthy planet for myself. So really taking those little steps for those children who may not be born or who have no idea what climate change even means.
Yeah, being a good ancestor, basically.
For me, what keeps me going is I've got nephews and nieces.
Mhm.
So like I'm not here just fighting for my generation, but for theirs. That's been really helpful and really empowering. But I also think about my family home in the islands. Just the fact that like climate change is gonna hit them before it hits us.
Mhm.
So the fact that my land is gonna be like surrounded by water is a lot to think about, but that I'm using that to fuel me and my activism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's selfish to fight against climate change for myself. I want to live in a great world because I want my kids to live in a great world and because I want their kids to live in a world
Mm.
eventually. And so, in many ways, the climate crisis is going on around us and it will impact me and my kids. Like, I am the climate crisis, really.
Mm. Yeah. And Kaylee, I really just wanted to jump on your point because New Zealand's in a very difficult predicament where we're not just thinking about ourselves in the ways in which you are all not just thinking about yourselves. We have to think about the communities that are around us, specifically our Pacific Islands that eventually are going to look at New Zealand as a place of refuge. And we're already seeing that in a lot of different ways. So, in the ways that you imagine the future of Aotearoa, the ways in which we engage with the climate in a more positive way that looks after communities, what are your hopes in that space? How are we protecting slash providing support to our more climate vulnerable communities in the Pacific?
I think New Zealand needs to think harder about the actions towards the other Pacific Islands. Could be wrong, but apparently a lot of the climate a lot of the islands who are suffering from the climate change are taking in other climate refugees, and that's just messed up because eventually their land is also going to be flooded. So I think New Zealand needs to actually talk to their people, other people, sorry, and figure out what they want and bring their Indigenous ideas on board and help them implement them. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
And the first step, and one of the first steps that we can take towards doing that is being a leader in the climate change space in the Pacific, modeling what it actually means to be climate change conscious and to be working towards the Paris Agreement and keeping 1.5 in reach, so that actually we can hopefully have Pacific Islands who we can still support in whatever ways they need, but and through recognizing the climate commitments that actually New Zealand has already made and needs to be held to accountable for, so that we can have Pacific Islands to be there.
Yeah. No, that's okay. And just, coming to a bit of a close on this part of the corridor about Aotearoa New Zealand, thinking about what it looks like to be climate resilient in alignment with iwi, in alignment with Mataranga Māori, where we're including a diverse range of perspectives, of voices, of experiences, where we're expanding not just in our big cities, but in our rural areas. There's climate education across. What does that look like to you? What does that feel like to you? What's your hope when what's your indication that we've hit that goal?
An indication we've hit climate change is when everyone's on the same playing field, to be able to understand that climate change is real. Because I come from a place in the South Island where you mention climate change and they think you're a tinfoil hat wearing, left leaning. They think you're crazy if you mention climate change. So really, climate education is about making sure that everyone understands that climate change is happening, addressing the problem, and making sure the education isn't one dimensional. Because like the education system, it's often very catered towards one group. So making climate education accessible for all, so that whether it's rural, urban, or any ethnic group you come from, being able to understand climate change and being able to mitigate it.
For me, it's bringing more Indigenous techniques and ways of life to the table because we've obviously tried a colonial way, and look where we are, of trying to solve climate change. So being able to implement Indigenous practices into our government, into everyday life, would really help.
Kia ora. And just to close off, last message. One, to the young people of Aotearoa that you've had a chance to talk to, who are a part of the communities that you're a part of, a message to them, and to the leaders that who get the opportunity to listen to this, both Chris's if they're on the speaker, a message to them as well. What do you have to say?
To the young people, it is to fight. It is to stand up and fight, or if you are fighting, is to keep fighting, because climate change requires change, and you have to fight for good change. And to Chris's, is next year we want to see you here. We want to see you in the room listening to all these people who are talking about climate change because it exists and because we have to do stuff about it.
To the young Māori people, keep doing your hakas, keep doing your waiatas, and keep Te Ao Māori alive. Can't be erased. To the two Chris's, I would just say be good leaders, practice what you preach, and identify climate change as a ever-pressing issue on our young people.
Kia ora.
Similar to Finley, keep fighting. Even small or big, you are making a difference to this climate change space.
And to both Chris's?
Do better.
Kia ora. So just a big round of applause to Finley, to Ceilidh, and to Ngārita. So this brings us to the end of both of our panels. We will be around for a lot of lovely mingling, but before we officially close off, I'm going to pass to Ceilidh to close off the space with a karakia.
Dear Lord, please bless everyone in their travels home. Make sure we learn a lot. And bless everyone's hearts and hope that they are able to seek the answer to their life. Amen.
Kia ora. Thank you, Ceilidh. And a waiata to finish. What can I say? All right. Itu? Aroha se whakapono me te rangi maari e tātou tātou e ano te aroha te whakapono me te rangi maari e tātou tātou e. Kia ora and thank you. We'll be here all week.